This is joint work with Imana and Zeyu, Shen, who are at Princeton, and John Heidemann at USC. So in 2022, the Department of Justice and Meta reached what they call the historic settlement, concluding about 10 years worth of academic research studying discrimination in ad delivery. And the settlement included a first ever legally mandated mitigation for discrimination in ad delivery that required Meta to build a so-called variance reduction system, or VRS. And the settlement applied only for housing ads. In this work, we compare the aspirations of what one would have hoped to receive from the settlement with its reality, and in particular with the implementation chosen by Meta for the settlement. So what are the key promises of the settlement? The key promise is to reduce variance in housing ad delivery for race and gender, where variance is defined as the difference in demographic distribution between an ad's eligible audience, or the audience essentially chosen by the advertiser, and the ad's actual audience, or the audience chosen by Meta's algorithmic and AI delivery algorithms. And for this reduction in variance, there were specific compliance metrics that were set that Meta has to satisfy, defined in terms of coverage or percentage of ads for whom this variance should be below a particular threshold. So for example, for ads that receive at least 300 impressions, the variance for gender should be less than 10% for 90.2% of the ads, and the variance for race should be less than 10% for 80% of the ads. And finally, a provision of the settlement is that there would be a third-party reviewer that would confirm Meta's implementation meets the compliance metrics. We identify several critical gaps in the settlement requirements itself. First of all, the settlement, when measuring variance, focuses on impressions rather than on the individuals that are affected by delivery. So, for example, delivering an ad to 100 unique men and to one woman 100 times under this measurement would achieve zero variance, and so perfect equity. Whereas, in fact, different number of people are affected. Moreover, the coverage itself is focused on the percentage of ads that meet the variance thresholds, not considering that different ads may have different reach. And so this allows a selective application of the system to exclude large ads, which would lead to a much larger share of impressions being excluded than what the coverage metric suggests. Furthermore, there were no transparency requirements made on the implementation, and there were no specific requirements placed on what data the third-party reviewer would receive, which ended up being extremely limited. Speaking of the VRS implementation, what's known is based on a white paper that Meta published and also an academic paper that they published, but that's still very, very little. In particular, we know that it's a machine learning system trained on past data that periodically measures a variance and automatically adjusts advertiser bids to change their likelihood of winning an ad auction. But the advertiser or anybody else is not receiving any information about this adjustment. And we also know that the system is implemented with privacy, so there's noise addition at every step of the measurement in the system. Also, the third-party reviewer doesn't have very much access to the implementation or its impact. Essentially, the third-party reviewer for each ad identified by a hashtag ID, receives the potential number of impressions per group and actual number of impressions per group, and the variance calculated based on this data by Meta. And so their role is limited to essentially checking an Excel formula, because they have no means to verify the accuracy of the data and no means to understand what impact this may be having on costs for the advertisers. And so these are the gaps that we set out to fill in our work through an independent evaluation, independent of Meta, of the third-party reviewer, etc. And what we find is that VRS does indeed reduce the variance for housing ads, but it makes ads more expensive for advertisers, and also the specific implementation that's chosen is suboptimal on kind of the fairness utility trade-off. And let me tell you more about this. How do we study this independently? Well, we ran the same ad twice, once with VRS enabled and once without VRS enabled. How can we enable VRS? We can just declare an ad to be a housing ad, and then VRS automatically kicks in. So we're running 36 different ads that are not housing ads, but in some cases we're declaring them to be housing ads in order to evaluate the impact of VRS. And then we look at the relative performance in these ads by race and gender, and we look at things such as variance, reach, and cost per 1,000 impressions. Indeed, what we find is that VRS does reduce variance by race for the housing ads to less than 10% in all the experiments we study. But the rosy picture ends here. When we look at what happens for credit and job ads, for which Meta voluntarily expanded its compliance with the settlement in 2023, we find that, and the graphs are not displaying, but we find that for housing ads, the variance does get decreased, but for credit and job ads, the variance pretty much stays the same and doesn't go under the 10% threshold. So what that tells us is that voluntary compliance does not lead necessarily to achieving the same metrics as the metrics specified in the settlement. What we also find is that VRS reduces utility for users and advertisers. Here we are plotting on the x-axis the reach for the ad when run without VRS, and on the y-axis for the same ad when it's run with VRS. And what you can see is that in most of the 36 experiments that we ran, the reach is higher for the ad when run without VRS. And a similar effect is observable with cost. VRS has higher cost per 1,000 impressions than the same ad run without VRS. You can say, well, we know that sometimes in order to ensure fairness, there's some sort of trade-off, and perhaps reduced reach and higher cost is an inevitable consequence of the settlement and of the trade-off. And to check that, we compare Meta's VRS, this complex reinforcement learning-based implementation, with an alternative simple implementation, which we call budget splitting, where rather than running one ad targeting all groups, the advertiser simply splits the budget equally between the groups that they're trying to target and runs separate ads for each of those groups. Again, here we plot on the x-axis what would be the reach and the cost when one does the budget splitting approach, and on the y-axis, what is the reach and the cost when one relies on the VRS. And what we find is that VRS is higher cost and lower exposure than budget splitting for all groups we consider. So in other words, this very simple alternative could have achieved the goals that VRS achieves without the same cost to the advertiser, without the same drop in the number of impressions that are shown overall. In conclusion, we find that the settlement terms have several gaps that should be addressed, and that platforms themselves should explore more efficient, more interpretable, more transparent efforts for addressing ad delivery discrimination. And kind of stepping back and asking what open questions does this raise, I think one challenge here is that we're attempting to fix one non-transparent system with another non-transparent system. And perhaps what's needed are really new paradigms where rather than solving machine learning problems with more machine learning, there is room for individuals to really exercise their controls and express their preferences over the economic opportunity ads that they want to see. And there's room for mandating what kind of data access or information should be available for the third-party auditor, so there is no need for this independent evaluation because the third-party auditor that's specified in the settlement did not have enough access. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions.